Welcome to VoiceOver Work, an audiobook sampler. Where do you listen? Today is May 12th, 2022, and we're going to help you find your next great listen. Today's book is a bit change of pace from our usual presentation. This is The Marine Corps Way of War, the evolution of the U.S. Marine Corps from attrition to maneuver warfare in the post-Vietnam era. This is not as much a theoretical book as it may sound, but an excellent history of the Marine Corps and its journey from a nascent fighting force to today's elite combat unit. From Marine recruits to history buffs to geopoliticians, this book is an excellent resource for the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. Hope you enjoy it.
Chapter 1. The Marine Corps Way of War. The concept of maneuver warfare is not new in military history, and may even have reached its apex during the Middle Ages, when armies of horse-mounted steppe warriors ran roughshod over Central and Southern Asia and Eastern Europe. The mobile hordes were finally stopped by the development, within sedentary civilizations, of firepower, after which a set-piece force held sway on battlefields, along with tactics that increasingly dismissed mobility and instead stressed concentrations of gunfire. This trend culminated in the First World War, a unique period when firepower technology far exceeded that of transportation, leaving gigantic armies to pummel each other to death or dig into the ground to avoid the carnage. The defeated major power in the Great War was Germany, which also became the first nation to explore how the new leaps in transportation technology during the 1920s and 30s, motor vehicles including tanks on the ground and bombers in the air, could loosen the strictures on warfare and once again allow widespread mobility on the battlefield. Robert M. Centino of the University of North Texas offers an initial broad-brush definition for German maneuver warfare that provides a good and workable frame of reference for this study. This definition will be modified as required by the adaptation of maneuver warfare by the Marine Corps. Historian Centino's description is found in his outstanding study titled, aptly enough, The German Way of War. The Germans called it Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement on the operational level. It meant the maneuver of large units to strike an enemy a sharp, even annihilating blow as rapidly as possible. It could be a surprise assault on an unprotected flank, or, better yet, both flanks, or, even better than that, his rear. Such a vigorous operational posture implied certain other characteristics: an army with an extremely high level of battlefield aggression, an officer corps that tended to launch attacks no matter what the odds, and a flexible system of command. The current work focuses on the development of a Marine Corps Way of War, MCWW, both externally and internally from the post-Vietnam period to the present era in Southwest Asia. It must be noted that both the U.S. Army as well as the Marine Corps were simultaneously exposed to the efforts of the Congressional reformers from the mid-1970s through to the mid-1980s. The Marine Corps was able to more fully embrace maneuver warfare and its doctrinal philosophy, strategy, and tactics. Thus, this work covers the Marine Corps from the early 1970s through to the 2010s as it wrestled with the implementation of this evolutionary transition. As an aside, it is interesting to note that the U.S. Army is just starting to investigate the potentials of maneuver warfare almost 40 years later. At best, the Army's Special Forces light infantry posture can be considered a type of maneuver warfare element practiced within the U.S. Army. Maneuver warfare suited the numerically smaller Marine Corps both from an intellectual as well as a practical basis. The Marine Corps has been unique from its beginning due to its small numbers in comparison to the larger U.S. Army. One can almost equate it to the armies of the Prussian Frederick the Great, whose small forces found success on the battlefields of Western Europe in similar doctrinal situations facing today's Marine Corps, partly because of its adoption of a philosophy of maneuver warfare. Although the Marine... Chapter 2. Bellow Wood to Beirut. From World War I to the latter part of the 20th century, the Marine Corps was involved in 15 engagements on 2 military levels, 4 major national warfare initiatives, and 11 minor or small war deployments. The 4 major involvements included World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War. The 11 small war actions during this period took place in Nicaragua, Honduras, Cuba, Mexico, Haiti, China, the Dominican Republic, Panama, Iran, Grenada, and Lebanon. The traditional American way of war, offensive-defensive methodology of warfare with synchronization as practiced by the Napoleonic French, was the national doctrine, strategy, and tactics employed in all of these involvements. Arguably, some exceptions can be noted in the small wars category, as codified in the Marine Corps publication Small Wars Manual, 1940. However, these did not play a major role in how America in general, or the Corps in particular, went about the business of warfare. It did, however, set the stage, beginning in the early 1980s, for the Marine Corps' future evolution into a variant of maneuver warfare philosophy. What is of importance for this work is the frame of reference for what originally developed into an accepted American way of war. The setting for the prosecution of war by the United States during this period effectively validated the efforts of General Ulysses S. Grant in successfully bringing the Civil War to a close. Grant and many of his fellow officers were influenced by what they learned as cadets at West Point. There, they became steeped in the lessons of Antoine Henry, Baron Jomini, a Swiss officer who served as a general in the French army, and later for the Russians. Jomini was one of the most celebrated writers on the Napoleonic art of war. According to historian Russell F. Weigley, Jomini's basic tenet of strategy could be boiled down to the necessity to bring the maximum possible force to bear against the decisive point in the theater of operations, while the enemy can muster only an inferior part of his strength there. To be able to bring superior strength against inferior strength, or weakness, continued Weigley, depends upon the proper ordering of one's lines of communication in relation to the enemy's. The tenets associated with Napoleonic warfare had considerable gravitas during this period. Napoleon had lost only 2 battles while winning nearly 50, and so was perceived as a model for emulation. Still, General Grant was not completely committed to this common line of military thought as it applied to his experiences during the Civil War. A number of factors eventually shaped Grant's strategy and tactics that ultimately led to victory. This shaping planted the seeds of an American way of war that, in some regards, still prevails today. In preparing for the eventual defeat of the Confederacy, General Grant moved away from the concentration of winning battles. His strategy centered on what it would take in the long view to achieve a complete victory. As a result, he settled upon a strategy of annihilation based upon the principle of concentration of mass. Grant set out to find and strike the main Confederate armies with the concentrated thrust of massive Federal forces until the enemy was beaten into impotence and could no longer fight back. The offensive became everything for the Union armies under the leadership of Grant, regardless of whether they won or lost each battle. He understood, where so many others did not, the attritional disadvantage under which the Confederacy labored. As a result, he moved on several fronts at once. Chapter 3. From Congress to the Corps. All the forces in the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. Victor Hugo. This chapter focuses on the genesis of what some have incorrectly called a revolution in military affairs, or RMA, and its early introduction by a group of reformers from inside and outside of the Marine Corps. Understanding the role played by this group is critical to understand how and why the Corps fights as it does. The term reform had been routinely misapplied by people in and out of the media during the post-Vietnam War period. The reform concept regarding maneuver warfare in general for the Marine Corps runs from the early 1970s through 1986. As such, it covers the unofficial doctrinal, strategic, and tactical implementation by the Marine Corps' 2nd MEF at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, by General Al Gray. The concept of maneuver warfare and its possible implementation by the U.S. military can be traced to 4 or 5 independent and somewhat unrelated sources, each initially working independent of the others. Not all of these efforts were from inside the military. In fact, much of the initiative came from the civilian sector. The beginnings of maneuverism were akin to a 20-gauge shotgun blast of buckshot hitting these targets of potential strategic and tactical change, explained Colonel Michael Wiley, USMC retired, one of the prime movers behind the concept. Initially, the independent and driving forces behind maneuverism included the following individuals: William Bill Lind, who was working for Ohio Senator Robert A. Taft, and later on the staff of Colorado Senator Gary Hart; Colonel John Boyd, USAF; Brigadier General Al Gray, at the time commander of the 2nd MEF, and Colonel Wiley, a Gray and Trainer confidant and instructor at the Marine Corps Amphibious Warfare School. These men were aided by a cadre of Marine Corps officers considered the free thinkers, who helped start the so-called RMA. It should be noted that Colonel Boyd was usually ignored or discounted in his scholarship within the U.S. Air Force, as well as the Department of Defense, when he ventured away from his specialty of fighter jet design and tactics. However, his biographer, Robert Coram, characterized Colonel Boyd as the founder, leader, and spiritual center of this guerrilla movement within the Pentagon. Although each of these men brought different skill sets and concepts to the table, the end result is that their efforts combined to reintroduce a German-type maneuver warfare to both the Army and the Corps. It is important to stress that reintroduce is the correct term, because the American military had previous first-hand knowledge of these tactics, strategies, and doctrine, garnered by both intelligence and direct combat against the Germans in North Africa and on the European continent during World War II. The military-political climate within the United States immediately following the Vietnam War reflected the somberness of the perceived yet unwarranted perceptions of military failure in Southeast Asia. Any failure there must be laid squarely at the feet of the political class that actually ran the war in Vietnam. The new initiative in doctrine was also joined with the economic responsibility of rebuilding the Defense Department at this time. Ancillary to this was the need to create a much smaller peacetime military. Congress's fiscal responsibility associated with this drawdown. Chapter 4: The United States Marine Corps in Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Part 1: Saddam Hussein meets General Al Gray's legacy. It is now more than 25 years since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 1990, and the U.S.-led coalition moved in to stop further aggression and eject the Iraqis from the small, oil-rich nation. The war marked the first time the United States openly and directly sent major land forces to fight in the Persian Gulf. The success of these endeavors renewed the assertiveness and confidence of the U.S. military and its projected foreign policy in the Middle East. The Marine Corps played a significant role in these operations, demonstrating a use of maneuver warfare to shape its battle space that would, in effect, become the Marine Corps way of war. Following Saddam Hussein's surprise invasion, the United States established a coalition of nations to defend Saudi Arabia and potentially other Gulf states from further Iraqi aggression, as well as to rid Kuwait of the Iraqi military takeover. These operations are generally known today as Gulf War I. The mission was twofold: protect Saudi Arabia, Operation Desert Shield, and expel Iraqi military forces from Kuwait, Desert Storm. This was the largest deployment of Marines since the Vietnam War, and the Corps' new doctrinal philosophy of maneuver warfare played a significant role in the success of these operations. The Marine Corps focused on the key tenets found in the newly published Fleet Marine Force Manual 1, FMFM1, War Fighting, and FMFM1-1 Campaigning. In particular, the following areas were the main focus of efforts, Schwerpunkt, for the Marine Corps inaugural maneuver warfare applications. 1. Maritime pre-positioning ships. 2. Shaping the battlefield, A. Electronically, B. Physically, C. Psychologically. 3. Feints that identified gaps in surfaces. 4. Maneuver warfare logistical support. As a general frame of reference for the Marine Corps' action in Gulf War I, the following chronology hits the milestones that were significant in the operational aspects and of the mission orders as they unfolded on the battle spaces in Kuwait and Iraq. Chronology of major events and milestones for Desert Shield and Desert Storm. August 2, 1990. The elite Iraqi Republican Guard crossed into Kuwait and began a two-pronged action to gain control of the tiny oil-rich kingdom. After breaching the border, the Guard divisions began converging on the capital of Kuwait City, coordinating their movements with partly helicopter-borne, division-sized unit of Special Operations troops. The forces linked up, and by nightfall, Iraqi forces had fully captured Kuwait and its capital. Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein had been making numerous threats against Kuwait, but the actual invasion and its magnitude caught the world by surprise. Iraq had waged a full-scale war with its neighbor Iran from 1980 to 1988, and the general consensus was that the Iraqi army was a well-equipped, battle-hardened force. For the United States, the first priority became the defense of Saudi Arabia. The disruption of Kuwaiti oil was inflicting losses on the global economy, and the prospect of a disruption of Saudi oil threatened to be disastrous for the West. The Saudis concurred with President George H.W. Bush that the threat was indeed grave, and Saudi leaders overcame their usual national apathy at allowing foreign troops into the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Chapter 5. Support from the Top. Because of Operation Desert Storm, the fighting-smart doctrinal philosophy of maneuver warfare entrenched itself within the fabric of the Marine Corps. The evolutionists had presented to the Corps the German model utilized during the early days of World War II, as well as a liberal dose of Sun Tzu. The Fleet Marine Force Manual 1, FM-FM1, provides more on this subject, including a complete definition of this marine-centric war-fighting doctrine. You will notice that this book, FM-FM1, does not contain specific techniques and procedures for conduct. Rather, it provides broad guidance in the form of concepts and values. It requires judgment and application. The thoughts contained here represent not just guidance for actions in combat, but a way of thinking in general. This manual thus describes a philosophy for action in war and in peace. The object of war is to impose our will on the enemy. The means to that end is the organized application or threat of violence by military force. War is the unique product of the dynamic interaction of myriad moral and physical forces. While founded on the laws of science, war demands, ultimately, the intuition and creativity of art. The war-fighting doctrine which we derive from our theory is one based on maneuver. This represents a change since, with the few notable exceptions, Stonewall Jackson in the Valley, Patton in Europe, MacArthur at Inchon, the American way of war traditionally has been one of attrition. The style of warfare generally has worked for us because, with our allies, we have enjoyed vast numerical and technological superiority. But we can no longer presume such a luxury. In fact, an expeditionary force in particular must be prepared to win quickly, with minimal casualties and limited external support, against a physically superior foe. This requirement mandates a doctrine of maneuver warfare. By this time, it should be clear that maneuver warfare exists not so much in the specific methods used, we eschew formulas, but in the mind of the Marine. Maneuver warfare is a way of thinking in and about war that should shape our every action. It is a state of mind born of a bold will, intellect, initiative, and ruthless opportunism. It is a state of mind bent on shattering the enemy morally and physically by paralyzing and confounding him, by avoiding his strength, by quickly and aggressively exploiting his vulnerabilities, and by striking him in the way that will hurt him most. In short, maneuver warfare is a philosophy for generating the greatest decisive effect against the enemy at the least possible cost to ourselves, a philosophy of fighting smarter. The primary critic of the Marine Corps' adoption of these warfighting tools remains Bill Lind. This camp argues that careerism, the policy or practice of advancing one's career, often at the cost of one's integrity, is superseding the implementation of true maneuver warfare. Some current junior officers complain that once a Marine officer attains a certain rank, the promotion system does not foster a true maneuverist posture because he or she must conform to career goals over philosophical warfare methodologies. They contended in the past, as they do now, that in the post-Gray commandancy years, true maneuver warfare has been forgotten or mostly ignored by both the more recent commandants and the Marine Corps leadership cadre as a whole. The evidence does not support this claim. Maneuver warfare's doctrinal usage has been Chapter 6. Small Wars and Humanitarian Assists, 1991 to 2001. The concept of a force in readiness is the Marine Corps' sweet spot, regardless of the type of action required to complete a particular mission. This chapter's main focus is on the strategy and tactics used by the Marine Corps and the application of maneuver warfare regarding the military and humanitarian assistance actions from the post-Desert Storm period through to the start of Operating Enduring Freedom in 2001. As discussed earlier, there are three accepted warfare philosophies today. 1. Attritional warfare. 2. Revolutionary or irregular warfare. 3. Maneuver warfare. The 2 decades under consideration exemplify what has been called small wars type deployments. For the Corps, this meant a projection of force in what could be considered an emergency use of military assets to either join in combat or carry out life-sustaining operations in times of natural or man-made disaster. The term small wars was defined in the 1940 Marine Corps publication Small Wars Manual as follows. The term small war is often a vague name for any one of a great variety of military operations. As applied to the United States, small wars are operations undertaken under executive authority wherein military forces combined with diplomatic pressure in the internal or external affairs of another state whose government is unstable, inadequate, or unsatisfactory for the preservation of life and of such interests as are determined by the foreign policy of our nation. It is important to note this was written and published during the post-Banana Wars era. The kinetic memory of those Marine deployments was still fresh in the DNA of the Corps' small wars history. The publication defined the philosophy, tactics, campaigning, and strategy eventually incorporated into the maneuver warfare doctrine, refined and enhanced by General Gray and his cadre of evolutionists. It was during the Gray commandancy that the Small Wars Manual was reprinted and redistributed to all Marines. It found its way into the military environments of Operation Enduring Freedom and Operation Iraqi Freedom. A redefined joint Army-Marine Corps counterinsurgency field manual was co-authored by General David Petraeus, U.S. Army retired, and General James Amos, Marine Corps Assistant Commandant retired, and published in 2007. It is important to note that roughly 90% of the counterinsurgency field manual comes from the original Marine Corps 1940 Small Wars Manual. Over its long and successful history, the Marine Corps integrated the maneuver warfare doctrine, strategy, and tactics into its combat and humanitarian assist approaches. This concept is nothing more than a clever manner in which to gain the upper hand during any adversarial event. An adversary can be anything from an armed enemy to natural or man-made disasters, or both. Maneuver warfare, therefore, can be expressed through military actions and non-military humanitarian assistance operations. In either case, the success of maneuver warfare depends upon the use of the following principles. 1. The military force that applies this form of warfare has to be decentralized. 2. If an action has to be communicated to the highest rank, the final decision must then be. Chapter 7. Operation Enduring Freedom, Afghanistan. In the aftermath of the attacks on September 11, 2001, the United States determined to bring an end to the ongoing threats of irregular or asymmetric warfare it had been facing since the late 1970s. The horrendous terror attacks on New York and Washington were the final straw, and formal military actions were commenced with congressional approval. Western civilization's warfare and its prosecution, as the world had experienced for the last 2,500 years, would provide the calculus to solving this problem of both attritional and irregular warfare. To a large extent, the new enemy was an amorphous, transnational, non-state belligerent, in this case based in the tribal areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan. These enemies were under the leadership of Al-Qaeda's Osama bin Laden and the Taliban's Mullah Omar. Bin Laden, a Saudi national, was a veteran of the Mujahideen Jihad, which had sought to expel the Soviet Union from Afghanistan. He had previously based his operations out of Sudan. However, Al-Qaeda had to relocate to Afghanistan when the United States applied heavy diplomatic pressure on Sudan to end its fostering of Al-Qaeda's terrorism. Al-Qaeda was a group of Islamist extremists from different countries formed in the wake of the Soviet-Afghan War. With these battle-hardened mujahideen, Al-Qaeda unleashed an international low-tech form of terrorism, or asymmetrical warfare, on the Western world in general, and on the United States in particular. America experienced the first Islamic attack on its own soil in 1993, when a group of jihadists unsuccessfully tried to blow up New York's World Trade Center. President Clinton dismissed the act as a civil crime rather than treat it as the terrorist act it clearly was, which made it an act of war. 5 years later, in August 1998, Al-Qaeda attacked 2 American embassies in Africa with great loss of life. Clinton responded by ordering a massive but wholly ineffective cruise missile attack on an Al-Qaeda installation in Afghanistan that did nothing to deter or defeat the enemy. In October of 2000, suicide bombers struck the destroyer USS Cole while at anchor in Aden. The attack killed 17 soldiers. George W. Bush was elected president 2 weeks later, and it was hoped his new administration would devise a solution to the growing Islamist threat. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists carried out another attack on the American homeland. 2 hijacked Boeing 767 jets were deliberately crashed into the World Trade Center towers, leading to the eventual collapse of the iconic business complex. More than 2,700 people perished in the collapsing inferno. Nearly 100 more people were killed in a simultaneous attack with another hijacked plane when the Islamic pilot flew it into the side of the Pentagon. That same morning, still another terrorist-controlled airliner crashed in Pennsylvania. The plane had been heading for Washington before passengers attempted what amounted to a suicide mission of their own to prevent the terrorists from flying it into another designated high-value target. The plane crashed in a field, killing everyone aboard. No fewer than 3,000 civilians and some members of the military lost their lives in this act of war, stemming from an Al-Qaeda fatwa against the United States. As the implications of this well-coordinated, large-scale jihadist attack wound their way through national and international fronts, President Bush called for a global war on terror. Chapter 8. Operation Iraqi Freedom. Throughout the 1990s, and more so after 9/11, the United States viewed Saddam Hussein's Iraq as a nation that fostered both internal terrorism and terrorism abroad. Saddam had violated the United Nations sanctioned directive to remove all of his supposed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. The issue of WMDs is still hotly debated, but WMD formed only one of the many reasons for invading Iraq. For the purposes of this study, it holds no significance on the operational art of maneuver warfare as practiced by the Marine Corps. On March 17, 2003, President George W. Bush gave Saddam Hussein a 48-hour ultimatum for he and his sons to abdicate control of Iraq. The failure to do so would result in a military conflict at a date to be determined. Saddam paid no heed to this warning, and the war began 20 minutes after President Bush's ultimatum expired. In accordance with General Tommy Frank's ground combat plan, the Army's 5th Corps would cross the Iraq-Kuwaiti border and attack Baghdad from the desert west of the Euphrates River. The Marine Corps would simultaneously attack east of the Euphrates through a largely populated area. General James Mattis' message to the Marines' 1st Division set the tone for what was to be expected from the coming Marine Corps way of war. 1st Marine Division, Commanding General's message to all hands. For decades, Saddam Hussein has tortured, imprisoned, raped, and murdered the Iraqi people, invaded neighboring countries without provocation, and threatened the world with weapons of mass destruction. The time has come to end his reign of terror. On your young shoulders rest the hopes of mankind. When I give you the word, together we will cross the line of departure, close with those forces that choose to fight, and destroy them. Our fight is not with the Iraqi people, nor is it with members of the Iraqi army who choose to surrender. While we will move swiftly and aggressively against those who resist, we will treat all others with decency, demonstrating chivalry and soldierly compassion for people who have endured a lifetime under Saddam's oppression. Chemical attack, treachery, and use of the innocent as human shields can be expected, as can other unethical tactics. Take it all in stride. Be the hunter, not the hunted. Never allow your unit to be caught with its guard down. Use good judgment and act in the best interests of our nation. You are part of the world's most feared and trusted force. Engage your brain before you engage your weapon. Share your courage with each other as we enter the uncertain terrain north of the line of departure. Keep faith in your comrades on your left and right, and Marine air overhead. Fight with a happy heart and strong spirit. For the mission's sake, our country's sake, and the sake of the men who carried the division's colors in the past battles, who fought for life and never lost their nerve, carry out your mission and keep your honor clean. You will demonstrate to the world there is no better friend, no worse enemy than a U.S. Marine. 6 Iraqi divisions stood guard in the Marine Corps Area of Operational Responsibility, AOR. The traditional route for any invasion of Iraq moved along the Tigris River from Basra north to Baghdad. Saddam therefore positioned 4 of his divisions along that route. The 5th Division was deployed farther south near the Rumalia oil fields, while... Chapter 9. Conclusions. A revolution in military affairs? For a major revolution in military affairs to have occurred, observed Sir Michael Howard, there must have taken place a military turning point in the history of mankind. Under this strict definition, the Marine Corps did not experience a RMA in its adoption of maneuver warfare philosophy during the Gray Commandancy. The introduction of the equestrian spur that would enable the use of heavy cavalry was certainly one development of this magnitude, as was the introduction of the compound bow, gunpowder, the rifled musket, the use of electronic communications equipment, the introduction of mechanized armored vehicles, the development of air power as an element of combined arms set the standard for an inclusion into the RMA pantheon. There are, of course, others that could be added to this list. From its inception to its status today as a major worldwide military force, the Marine Corps has, officially and unofficially, practiced maneuver-type warfare. In the recent past, the concepts institutionalized by the Corps can be traced in part to its roots, doctrinal military philosophy, or DNA, including adherence to what has been termed a German way of war. Initially, during the Marine Corps' evolution, Bewegungskrieg, maneuver warfare tactics, did not sit well within the hierarchy of the Corps senior leadership, officers, and non-commissioned officers alike. Initially, the influence of the maneuverists was not viewed positively because it was seen as trying to alter the fighting tradition of the Marines. One of the proponents of the use of modern German maneuver warfare tactics, Bill Lind, managed to alienate a large part of the Marine Corps warrior population. Still, Inroads were made that eventually led to the institutionalization of this philosophy within the current Corps. This change, however, was much more of an evolution than a revolution. Some have even referred to it as a renaissance. In either case, revolution or rebirth, these definitions did not accurately capture the true picture of a Marine Corps way of war. The ethos and military ethic that is part and parcel of the Corps managed to unify ad hoc ways of warfighting in both its conventional attritional doctrine and its non-conventional maneuver warfare. The prime mover of this concept, General Al Gray, observed that maneuver warfare is not new per se. Lieutenant General Bernard Traynor observed that in adopting and or adapting the philosophy of maneuver warfare, the Marine Corps was returning to its roots in warfighting learned during the Banana Wars, but shelved during World War II, Korea, and to some extent Vietnam. The re-emergence of this concept under General Gray was a reflection of the Marines' experience in Vietnam and the demoralizing effect of Beirut and its aftermath. The term that was bandied about in the press during this time frame was reformers. This was and remains a misnomer because it was eventually applied to those within the Marine Corps seeking serious revisions to how the Corps would fight future battles. General John Kelly set the reformer name aside and argued that the correct terms are, and should have been, maneuverist, and for those opposed to the concept of maneuver warfare, traditionalists. It is now readily apparent that the gap in understanding has been considerably narrowed within the Marine Corps family, thanks to General Kelly's terminology. The history of the Marine Corps is replete.
This episode of VoiceOver Work, an audiobook sampler, was brought to you by Newton Media Group. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's show, head over to newtonmg.com and learn more about the podcast, our YouTube channel, and our Facebook presence. Have a good one, and see you in 3 or 4 days.